Hey there, it's Orphe Diwangi, the co-host of the Everyday Economics podcast. Exciting news! Check out my new weekly column at thecentersquare.com. Join me as I break down complex economic trends in a way that's easy to understand for everyone. Check out the column every week and stay informed about the economic forces shaping our world. Be sure to subscribe to the Everyday Economics podcast and visit thecentersquare.com today.
Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can go check out all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today, we'll be discussing the various states' use of hundreds of millions of dollars in opioid settlement money that they receive from healthcare companies as part of the much larger opioid crisis that is happening across the United States. And joining me today to discuss this is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennen. Anthony, thanks for joining us on America's Talking.
Good to be here.
We also have the Arizona reporter from the Center Square, Cameron Arcand. Cameron, welcome to America's Talking.
Thank you.
And from the great state of Washington, we have Tim Clouser. Tim, how are you? We're recording this bright and early out there, and you joined us anyway. So thanks for joining us on America's Talking.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
All right, Anthony, I want to start with you. We're talking about, broadly kind of the opioid crisis in America, but really the implications of that. But I do want to start talking about the issue itself. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but nationally, what's the conversation around opioids? What's happening with it? And then specifically in your case in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So, some broad figures here. Nationally, it's looking like from more than a dozen different settlements related to opioids and the addiction crisis, states are going to get around $55 billion in total to deal with these problems, to help combat addiction, hopefully get some people some help. How that looks from the state level varies widely. Just to start here, just looking at transparency, some states are doing a much better job at tracking these and making sure it's publicly available. My home state of Pennsylvania, we're looking at about 85% of that will be a little easier to track compared to neighboring Ohio. It's looking like 55% of those opioid expenditures are going to be accessible to the public. So it really varies state by state. Colorado and Florida have basically said we'll make sure 100% of this spending is available to the public to look at. Other states, they're not doing so well. And so this is also a factor of how states are spending this. So states have wide latitude as far as, who they want to give the money to. Pennsylvania, for example, 70% of the spending is going to be based on how counties choose to spend the funding. Then another 15% will be dictated by the General Assembly, and then another 15% will be dictated by a few jurisdictions who are more directly involved with the opioid settlements. So this kind of varies by state. Usually we're seeing a lot of county level spending, but again, states have wide latitude in how to dictate this money, and how states spend this money really falls under what's called Exhibit E from these settlements. So Exhibit E basically says what can and can't qualify as an approved use for spending this opioid money. And there's generally wide latitude in this. But what comes out is most of this, they don't want to see some mistakes that were made, say, a few decades ago with tobacco money. They don't want to see money get spent just to, fill local budgets that have a shortfall on policing or something. They want to make sure that how this money gets spent, it's tied to actually treating addiction, to improving it, to making sure that people are getting the help they need. So, there's a few restrictions here, but there's still at the same time some wide latitude, and there's some transparency concerns state by state.
So we're talking about the opioid settlement money that came from healthcare companies. And Anthony, you were talking about in Pennsylvania, East Coast. This is an issue that has obviously impacted East Coast, West Coast, southern border, everything. Tim, I want to talk about the state of Washington. Let's talk briefly about what is the state of the opioid crisis in the state of Washington. I mean, this seems like it's almost one of the mecca centers in the United States.
Yeah, Washington State has really been trying to hamper down on the opiate crisis here in Washington, as well as homelessness, as the two often tied together. But I know that Washington's set to receive about $518 million from these settlements over the next decade or two, with this first round that we're talking about being paid out over the next 17 years or so. I can't really speak on the situation of the state as a whole, but In terms more of Eastern Washington, with an emphasis on Spokane being the second biggest city in the state, homelessness and the opiate crisis is just going up and up and up. I have a statistic here that says back in 2019, Spokane County had 80 overdose deaths. And last year, that number shot up to 301, with almost 200 of those deaths coming from fentanyl directly. So it is quite an observable difference over the last few years here in Spokane.
Yeah, and in the state of Washington, obviously, there's homelessness issues. We have drug issues kind of going hand in hand. I want to bring in Cameron Arcand here down in Arizona. One of the interesting things about this settlement money is there have been some legal challenges, or at least questions around this as well.
That's correct. So in the Arizona state budget, during negotiations, it came out that the money, some of the funds, would be used essentially as a sweep to support the Department of Corrections system under the condition that it would be used for substance abuse treatment. Now, this is because there was an Auditor General report from 2021 that showed that people were not getting the treatment that they needed or designated to have when they are in the prison system. Of course, the way that this was allocated and the way it was outlined raised concern among both Republicans and Democrats, because they distrusted the way the Department of Corrections may be using the money or would use the money. And this even led to a legal challenge from Attorney General Chris Mays. And now what she did was she filed a legal action after the budget passed. And what that legal action did is the judge ruled for a temporary restraining order to prevent that moving of funds. They worried that if it was used outside of the conditions or kind of on a stretch of the memorandum of understanding given on these funds, that it would put the other money into jeopardy. So there was the temporary restraining order. And then there was a hearing a few days ago where another judge said that that money could go forward. And that's probably likely has to do with the conditions outlined in the budget, the fact that some of the funding was non-lapsing, meaning it could be used in previous years and would fall under that purview of being acceptable use of funds. Now, like we mentioned, Arizona is very unique where, we're dealing with both the medical side of this and the border side of this. So opioid treatment and trafficking of opioids into the United States is really front and center here.
And Anthony, I want to go back to you. So, we talked about states getting this money, and they're obviously trying to spend this money in a way that will help solve the issue. And there are different ways that this money's attempting to be spent, right? In the state of Pennsylvania, it's kind of interesting because in 2021, they have had this Pennsylvania Opioid Trust, but majority of those funds that were sent out in 2021, they still haven't even been spent yet.
Yeah, I think part of this is, growing pains to make sure every county has, an opioid commission to kind of direct this money and get it going. But yeah, the state has sent out more than $200 million now since 2021, but only $70 million of that has been spent. And I think part of the issue here is also, the counties look at what they want to do with it and how they want to send it out. And then they have to come back to the state opioid trust to make sure that these projects, check all the legal boxes. They meet the limitations from Exhibit E. And then the state trust recommends approval for those projects. So I think a little bit of this is bureaucracy. A little bit of this is local officials not moving quickly. But I think it also just shows, the difficulty here of we're getting so much money coming in, but, especially in some of these small rural areas, you don't really have the capacity on the ground to direct a lot of this. We are seeing a big investment in things like county jails implementing medication-assisted treatment to deal with addiction behind bars, which is very, very common in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure in a lot of other states. So, we're getting some good programs out there, but I think this also highlights a transparency issue because in Pennsylvania, the Opioid Trust, they break out into working groups to review, hundreds of projects on the county level and make sure they're aligning with what can and can't be funded with this money. However, we don't actually see the debates over these projects. So, in Philadelphia, which its county is contiguous with the city sent in a list of basically mini grants they're doing with the money to approve. And it ranges, from medication-assisted treatment to wound care in some of the worst neighborhoods of Philadelphia dealing with addiction to, youth leagues to keep kids busy instead of getting into, gang violence or addiction issues. And some of these are getting approved. Other of these are getting denied, but the public and counties don't actually see the criteria or like why this is getting rejected, why this is getting approved. So I think we're also seeing a lot of counties are kind of gun shy, where they don't want to come in and say we're going to do this because they don't know what's actually going to happen, or they don't want to fall afoul of something and then have to repay $200,000 for a program. So I think there's Pennsylvania, we're seeing a situation where there's high need. I mean, we have thousands of people every year dying from opioid addictions and thousands more suffering with it. But the lack of transparency here, the lack of understanding what the trust sees as appropriate or inappropriate, I think really slows down how fast we're spending this money and how we're getting this money to high valued uses.
And in the same way, in the state of Washington, Tim, I'm going to go back to you. We see the attempts to address this. For example, in Spokane, which is the area of Washington that you cover specifically, they ratified a state of emergency because of this opioid crisis. But what does that really mean in terms of impact? I mean, what does that look like from kind of a practical standpoint?
Yeah, Mayor Lisa Brown declared a state of emergency over the opioid crisis at the beginning of this month, and that really just streamlines funding for her towards this initiative, essentially allowing her to bypass the request for proposal process and any action needed by city council to a large degree to just implement funding towards this initiative as she sees fit with, certain guidelines as well. But the initial investments with her state of emergency used $1 million of that opiate settlement money. The city of Spokane has about $2.2 million available. So they've spent about $1 million of that so far on the state of emergency so far. That goes towards 2 fire department programs, essentially intended to address high utilizers of the emergency response system. And a lot of that has to do with overdoses, getting those people the proper care they need without putting additional stress on the criminal justice and healthcare systems. But the state of emergency also allows her to use other pools of funding outside of the settlement dollars. So a lot of this money is going into short-term contracts in the meantime, but those contracts could run up as soon as 3 months. So after that would leave Brown pulling from other pools of money. Meanwhile, the city of Spokane has a $50 million structural deficit ahead of next year's budget.
And down in Arizona, Cameron, earlier you mentioned that being a border state, it creates kind of a different challenge or set of challenges. How is Arizona approaching this different from what we just heard in the state of Washington and in the state of Pennsylvania?
Well, the big thing has to do with enforcement, right? Where making sure that when it comes to illicit fentanyl and illicit opioids, that these are stopped when they come into the interior of the United States and into Arizona. And that is done and does require quite a bit of state funding for the Department of Public Safety, for, just these other agencies and local law enforcement. There's this crew out in Cochise County, Arizona called Sabre, and you talk with these guys, and it's very interesting what they do is they kind of keep an eye on what's going on at the border on the local law enforcement level, and you have these different ways that they're monitoring this activity. Now, you always hear the argument that most of the fentanyl coming across the border is coming into the country through legal ports of entry. That's definitely accurate, but what doesn't really change the concern there is, that still has to be apprehended by law enforcement once you get to that point, once you get into the United States. And when you have law enforcement, whether that's local, state, or federal, that is strained, that's less resources for them to go out and check cars and to seize these drugs, but they're already seizing them in incredibly high amounts. And it does show that, when you have the resources, the systems to stop the flow of this into the country does work.
And Anthony, kind of hopping off that idea of the involvement of law enforcement, you wrote an article over at the Center Square that was titled, "The Opioid Crisis, quote, not a situation that can be solved by police." What does that mean? I mean, explain that a little more.
Yeah, I think this is something we've seen as we've dealt with the war on drugs broadly, right? Where you can't just arrest people and the problem goes away. You need the police watching, where these drugs are coming from, what's happening on the street, because, once you have drug dealing out and about, violence always comes with that. It's very hard to avoid anything like that. We've seen with fentanyl, if you have people in neighborhoods doing drugs and you're not enforcing the law, you're getting used needles out on the street, you're endangering the public, and you're driving down property values. I mean, it really just spirals into destroying a neighborhood. But at the same time, an arrest does not fix addiction. And Pennsylvania's legislators are talking about potentially adding in some laws where if you overdose and the police get to you, you can then be forced into treatment. Because, we're having more than 5,000 Pennsylvanians dying from an overdose every year. There's been this shift, and you even see it in the makeup of Pennsylvania's General Assembly, the number of legislators who either have had some form of drug addiction or who have lost a loved one due to an overdose. It really kind of shifts the conversation to how do we get these people help? We've seen the rise of drug courts where if someone's arrested for some sort of drug addiction or drug offense, rather than just throwing them in jail, you push them into a treatment program. We've seen on the county level a much needed expansion of medication assisted treatment. You look at just how many prisoners in Pennsylvania's system are, addicted to drugs. It's overwhelming. And I think this is getting to a point where, police officers can only do so much. Police officers are there to maintain public order. But what's really needed now is more of a healthcare approach where if you just leave someone to be an addict, either in jail or you release them after they've served time, that's not dealing with them in the long term. And eventually they'll recidivate, they'll commit another crime, and then the process just repeats. So we're seeing much more of a shift, even among local law enforcement, talking about this of we can't just arrest people and that will solve the problem. We need to make sure these people are getting into treatment of when they leave those services or when they are released from a hospital after an overdose, they're connected into recovery workers or any sort of addiction specialists and counselors, making sure that they have a path to have a community outside of using drugs and finding a stable path in life so then they can get off it and find meaning in another way. And, there's an important part of making sure you're maintaining order and making sure that you're getting rid of the supply and diminishing demand, but making sure that people can rehabilitate. That seems to be where a lot of the energy is going, and seeing that, that is the long-term solution rather than a short-term solution of using police to deal with it.
And Tim, we're seeing this a little bit in the state of Washington. One of the things that the opioid settlement funds is allowing Washington to do is expand its CARES program. Can you talk a little bit about what the CARES program is and what it does?
Yeah, that CARES program from the Spokane Fire Department essentially sends social workers when on calls, when referred to from Spokane's police department or a fire department response. And it's similar to that high utilizer initiative where instead of putting an additional strain on the criminal justice or healthcare system, it allows social workers to respond and give adequate care at that moment while also coordinating care with local providers so that they can address those needs. And this program has been going on for a little while now, but prior to this funding that it just got from this opiate settlement funds, the program was going to have to close shop because it just couldn't afford to keep going. So this investment essentially allows it to keep going, but it's not the only one going on in Spokane. I mentioned the city of Spokane's investments with its opiate settlement funds, but Spokane County is also investing money as well. They've received about $8 million so far and have already decided to spend about $7.2 million of that. And that's going to go towards 23-hour crisis relief and sobering center, other expansion of sobering services. It's also going to go towards supporting parents of children with neonatal absence syndrome, which is essentially just when a baby is born and then begins withdrawing from drugs. So they're focusing on that, really just detox prevention and treatment efforts. Additionally, the county is launching a study that's going to track opiate use and overdoses throughout the county to really get an idea of where those hotspots are. And it's spending $200,000 on that. But one thing I noticed the difference between Spokane County's investments and the city of Spokane's investments is just the community feedback between the two. I mean, in the city of Spokane, you have Brown with her state of emergency. And she's just allowed to spend a lot of that money as she sees fit under those guidelines. But Spokane County used a community survey to establish its priorities moving forward. Additionally, with that state of emergency in the city of Spokane, there's just a lack of benchmarks there, which the city council has brought up as well, which is frustrating for them because she's allowed to keep funding these contracts and initiative without taking into account benchmarks to track progress along the way. Is this actually working, or are tax dollars just being thrown away essentially?
And Anthony, I want to wrap it up here with you. I mean, what Tim was just kind of getting at, which this is really the crux of the matter. I don't think anybody would say there's not an opioid issue, right? Or a crisis. There's no question there. But in terms of addressing it, I think the concern is that, is this a situation where there's almost just money being thrown at a problem, quote, being thrown at a problem? It's being spent drastically different in different areas of the country, different states, different cities, for example. And is there any checks and balances system to, try to ensure that things are actually being done in a impactful way? I mean, what's the next step here in this attempt to address the opioid crisis? Because you brought up earlier, Anthony, the war on drugs, right? And I think a lot of people would look at the last couple decades of the quote war on drugs and say there's been a lot of quote wasted spending on that to get to where we're at today. Is this just an extension of this, or is this a little bit different than the war on drugs?
I think the fundamental problem here is fentanyl is fundamentally different from what we were seeing, with meth or with heroin or with earlier iterations of the war on drugs. And so that complicates things because basically the reason why we've seen deaths from overdose skyrocket is because fentanyl has displaced heroin. Heroin compared to fentanyl is relatively safer and you don't necessarily die from it. You do, but the death rate is much, much lower. The fundamental problem we're dealing with here is we don't have a great handle on what works. We see some promising studies, but the problem with studies, of course, is they might work on a small scale, but they won't necessarily replicate everywhere. And so ideally, we would see state opioid trusts kind of doing, testing what works here, what works there, and coming back and evaluating these things. And then ideally, you have public transparency so the public can see what's happening, which is why one of the main concerns of a lack of transparency is we can't necessarily compare and contrast and see what's right. So we're dealing with the situation of some things look like they work and we need to run with them. But, 5-10 years down the road, we may realize, we spent $10 million on this, but it doesn't actually replicate. It doesn't work. It doesn't help people. So, a lot of these places, a lot of the officials responsible for how to spend this money are not in an enviable position. It's not like, the housing supply and demand where when you build more supply to meet demand, the price goes down. We could spend a lot of this money and it looks like it should work and it just doesn't. How to get to these places is, on one hand, why Exhibit E exists, to make sure that even if we do waste this money, we're at least spending it in a way where we can get ready for the future and pivot to something that does work. The problem with all this is because we're seeing this on the county level being led for the most part from state to state, county officials will have different priorities and different prior assumptions going into this. And so I think this question of making sure we're not wasting money is tied up in this idea of we don't really know what's wasteful and what's not wasteful yet. Some things we can see, right? I mean, it can be obvious in some instances, but other things, we're really operating in a fog. And how to get out of that, we can do the scientific method. We can make sure we're tracking this money and we're making sure that counties and states are talking with each other of what works, what seems promising, what's a total waste of time. But yeah, I think a lot of people assume we know what works and what doesn't. But unfortunately, we have a lot of money, but we don't have a lot of answers yet. And that is simply the burden that we have to deal with for the next 15, 20 years as this money gets rolled out and spent.
Yeah, and that being said, I want to thank Anthony, Tim, and Cameron for joining us today. Listeners, keep up with what's going on in your state around this spending, around the opioid crisis at thecentersquare.com. You can go down to your state page, find it, read everything that's going on there. Guys, I want to thank you for joining me today. And for you listeners, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We'll be back next time with another episode of America's Talking.
Hey there, it's Orphe Diwangi, the co-host of the Everyday Economics podcast. Exciting news! Check out my new weekly column at thecentersquare.com. Join me as I break down complex economic trends in a way that's easy to understand for everyone. Check out the column every week and stay informed about the economic forces shaping our world. Be sure to subscribe to the Everyday Economics podcast and visit thecentersquare.com today.